People ask me constantly, what is the single biggest warning sign in a relationship where there's a significant age difference? And usually I'm expected to say something about the gap itself, as if the number of years between two people's birthdays tells us anything meaningful on its own, but I can't. I sat across from couples with a 30-year difference who related to each other with more mutual respect than couples I've seen who were born the same month. So the number is not the red flag. So what is the red flag? The red flag is asymmetry of voice. Whose voice actually shapes the relationship? Whether both people's preferences carry equal weight when a decision gets made, or whether one person's preferences are treated as the default and the other person's preferences are treated as requests that need justification. This shows up in small ways long before it shows up in anything dramatic. It shows up in whose schedule gets protected without discussion and whose schedule gets rearranged as a matter of course. It shows up in whose bad mood requires the household to adjust and whose bad mood is expected to be managed quietly and alone. And it doesn't look like abuse, it looks like ordinary texture of daily life we're living. And that's exactly what makes this red flag so difficult to name, because it doesn't announce itself as control. It accumulates over time. So I want to pause here and give this pattern some history, because it isn't just a clinical impression. In the early 80s, a group of researchers in Duluth, Minnesota, interviewed women who had lived with controlling partners, asking them to describe exactly what their partners did to keep control of the relationship. What emerged from these conversations became known as the power and control wheel. And what struck the researchers who compiled it was how rarely the tactics were physical. Alongside outright violence, women described being controlled through money, decisions about children, emotional put-downs, undermining of their relationships, and constant assertion of privilege by the more powerful partner. The will was built specifically to show that domination in a relationship rarely announces itself as a single dramatic event. It is that climate that is sustained by many small tactics that individually seem almost minor, but they accumulate, and it makes it hard for a person living inside to see it clearly. Later, the sociologist Evan Stark took this idea further with his concept of coercive control, and I think his framing is very important, and you can take it to look at your relationship. Stark argued that domination in an intimate relationship is not only about episodes of physical harm, but about an ongoing pattern aimed at stripping away a partner's independence and autonomy. His point was that you could remove every act of violence from a relationship and still be left with something that functions like captivity, because the person on the receiving end has slowly lost the ability to move, speak, and choose freely without first calculating the cost. So, of course, not every age gap relationship with an imbalance is heading towards something so severe. Most aren't. But the research gives us a vocabulary for something we otherwise have difficulty describing. And this is why I think it's useful to know the categories these researchers identified, because they show up in everyday muted versions, even in relationships that would never be called abusive. So there's isolation, there's gradual narrowing of who a person sees regularly, so that the partner becomes the primary, sometimes only, source of company and validation. There's what researchers call minimizing, denying, and blaming, where concerns get reframed as overreactions, and conflict somehow always finds its way back to being the other person's fault. There's economic control, which in an age-gap relationship often takes softer form. It looks like one partner managing all the finances because they're simply better at it or more experienced, well, until the other partner realizes they don't actually know what their own financial picture looks like. And there's the assertion of privilege, the assumption that one partner's status, whether that status comes from age or income or career, or maybe more life experience, entitles them to make final decisions. None of this on their own prove a relationship is unhealthy. Plenty of loving relationships have one partner who manages the money or has wider circle of friends. What the research asks us is to notice whether these patterns move in one direction only, whether they concentrate decision-making power in one person's hands over time. I want to draw a distinction that I think gets lost in most conversations about this topic, which is the difference between deference and disappearance. Deference is something healthy, something that partners do for each other all the time. You might defer to your partner's judgment about a financial decision because they have more experience with money. You might defer to their read on a social situation because they're better at reading people. Difference moves in both directions over time, and it's chosen, it's not assumed. Disappearance is different. It's when one partner stops offering an opinion at all, not because they've decided to trust the other person's judgment on a particular issue, but because they've learned slowly, without maybe even being told directly, that offering an opinion isn't worth the cost. If you want to know whether you're looking at difference or disappearance, ask the person in question what they think about something unrelated to the relationship itself, something low stakes, and which how quickly and how fully they answer. People who've learned to disappear often take a visible pause before answering even very simple questions because the habit of checking whether an opinion is safe to have has become automatic. The practical piece of advice I give clients who are trying to evaluate their own relationship is this: pay attention not to what your partner says about respecting your independence, but to what actually happens the next time your independence produces an outcome that your partner did not want. Anyone can say they value your autonomy when your autonomy is agreeing with them. The real test comes when your autonomy leads you somewhere inconvenient for the relationship as it is currently structured. Maybe you take a job that requires travel. Maybe you decide to spend more time with a friend that your partner has never liked. Maybe you go back to school and suddenly have less time and energy for the relationship than you used to. Watch what happens in that exact moment. A partner who is capable of tolerating your growth will feel some discomfort and will say so honestly while still supporting the choice. A partner who has been relying on your dependence will find a way to make the choice seem unreasonable, selfish, or evidence that something is wrong with you or with the relationship. It is also worth noticing how this pattern is rarely announced through argument. It is usually announced through mood. A partner who's been relying on the relationship's current balance of power doesn't typically say that they don't want you to grow more independent. They become withdrawn. They become less warm for a few days. They find something unrelated to be irritated about. And because the discomfort is never named directly, the partner on the receiving end is left to do the work of figuring out what went wrong. And often the fastest way to restore warmth is simply to quietly retreat. This is one of the most effective and least feasible ways that power gets protected in a relationship, because no one ever has to say the words "don't grow" out loud. If you're on the other side of this and you're the older partner in an age gap relationship, the practical advice is just as important. Ask yourself honestly whether you would be comfortable if your partner disagreed with you in front of other people. Not privately, where of course it's easier to manage, but publicly, where your reaction would be visible to others. If the idea makes you uncomfortable in a way that goes beyond ordinary embarrassment, that discomfort is worth examining because it often points directly at how much of the relationship's stability depends on your partner not challenging you. Healthy authority in a relationship doesn't require constant agreement to feel secure. It can absorb disagreement without feeling threatened by it. So, two people with a large gap in years and a small gap in power tend to grow into genuine partnership over time. Two people with any gap in years, large or small, and a large gap in power tend to follow a much more predictable and much more painful path, where one person's world gradually contracts while the other person's world stays exactly the same size. This is, in a sense, the same finding the Duluth researchers reached decades ago from a very different starting point. They weren't studying age gap relationships specifically. They were simply asking what allows one person's autonomy to erode inside a relationship while the other person's stays fully intact. And what they found again and again was that the erosion happens through accumulation, not through any single decisive moment. If you want maybe a single question to carry with you, it's this one: when I disagree, does the relationship make room for that? And if you're not sure how to answer that, the research gives you a simple way to check. Notice how much smaller your world has gotten since the relationship began. A relationship built on genuine partnership tends to expand both people's lives, even when the two people started from very different places. A relationship built on power tends to expand one person's life at the expense of the others, quietly, one small accommodation at a time. If this video resonated with you, please share in comments what your experience with either age gap relationships or power relationships has been so far. And if there's any advice you can give, I always welcome it. I believe that we can learn from each other. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.